just say welcome to everyone as they're joining us into the room. We're just going to wait a few minutes just to let everybody join us here today. If you'd like to say hello to everybody else as you're joining, feel free to use the chat function. You can type in there if you'd like to say hello or let us know where you're from. It's always lovely to know where everyone's joining us from this evening. Good evening to those just joining us. We're just going to wait just another moment just to let the last few people who are coming in through the waiting room. If you'd like to say hello to anyone, do put your information in the chat just to say hello and let us know where you're from this evening. Oh, so far as far away from Crouch End and then all the way down to Dorset, it looks like. I can see somebody in there as well.
Cornwall.
Oh, and we've got somebody in whose father is Ziggy Shipper. Hello. It's always lovely to see families of our survivors who've spoken at the museum. Oh, and Joan, it looks like your daughter's in the audience as well. Shelley's here.
My son is actually here, but he's sitting out of view.
Ah, I can also see we've got people from, I think NJ must stand for New Jersey, USA. Someone will have to correct me. Rachel, correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks like that.
Japan.
All around the world this evening. Right, I'm going to start us off, I think. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening to mark Holocaust Memorial Day. My name is Frances Jeans, and I'm the Interim Director at the Jewish Museum, London. The museum holds an event annually to remember Holocaust Memorial Day. And this year, it's our first time hosting this event virtually. So it's wonderful to be able to join together in this way, whilst our physical doors are unfortunately remaining closed. I know we have people joining us this evening now from across the UK and actually much further away from all over the world, it seems. So you are very welcome to join us this evening. The theme for Holocaust Memorial Day 2021 is Be the Light in the Darkness. And this theme encourages us to remember one of the darkest times in our shared history, to stand together and to remember the 6 million individuals murdered, together keeping their memory alive. We also remember those who brought light in this dark time. We remember the bravery of those who've resisted, those who risked everything to rescue others, and those who showed kindness in the darkest of times. Holocaust Memorial Day is not restricted to remembering. The theme of Be a Light in the Darkness encourages us to reflect on where there is darkness today and how we can bring light. This could be the darkness of rising anti-Semitism, of Holocaust denial, or discrimination of minority groups. We look back and remember, but we also look at our world today and how we can be a light in the darkness, and how both individuals and organizations can join together against prejudice and discrimination. At the Jewish Museum London, we're committed to challenging stereotypes and promoting tolerance and understanding through education. And our Holocaust education program forms just a cornerstone, a key part of this. Through our exhibitions, our school workshops, and our public events, we share personal stories of those affected by the Holocaust, and we work to inspire others to both remember and to stand up against injustice in today's world. There is one group of people without whom Holocaust education at the museum would look very different indeed. They are our Holocaust survivor speakers. Individuals, including our two wonderful speakers today who have given their time and their energy to the museum for many years, sharing their testimony and working with us on our legacy projects. I'm going to hand over now to Emma, our engagement officer at the Jewish Museum, to introduce this evening's event and our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you again to everybody for joining us for today's Holocaust Memorial Day event. This evening, two of our Holocaust education speakers, Ruth Barnett and Joan Salter, will share their testimony with us. This will then be followed by a Q&A session. And you, our audience, will have the opportunity to ask questions to both of our speakers. For this, you can use the Q&A function on Zoom, and we will answer as many as we are able to. I would like to say at the beginning that we are very grateful also to Camden Council for partnering with us in this event, and to the Mayor of Camden, who is joining us today and will conclude our event, leading our candle lighting. This will be followed by a minute's silence to remember those who were murdered in the Holocaust. This evening's event is being BSL interpreted by Peter Abraham and live subtitled by Joanne from Stage Text. And we would like to thank both of them for their contribution in making this our most accessible Holocaust Memorial Day event yet. Now, throughout the evening, Mona from the Jewish Museum team will be monitoring the chat. So if you are having any technical difficulties or need any support, do type into the chat and we will do our best to support you. So I would now like to begin our event by introducing our first speaker, Ruth Barnett. Ruth has been speaking at the Jewish Museum London for many years. As well as sharing her story in person, she has written about her experiences and contributed to our temporary exhibition, Remembering the Kindertransport 80 Years On. Now, her testimony forms a key part of our virtual classrooms on the Kindertransport. And I would like to thank you so much, Ruth, for joining us this evening. And I will now hand over to you to share your testimony.
Thank you very much, Emma. I really miss coming to the Jewish Museum, but this is the next best thing. This year, Holocaust Memorial Day is the 20th annual remembrance of the Holocaust and all that it meant. Yet it took 55 years before that even began. Because we didn't get started early enough in facing what happened in the Holocaust, it has become something that is very difficult to go back and rectify. And sadly, the chanting of never again in 1945 at the end of World War II and the Holocaust has a hollow ring because it has not been achieved. It is yet again and again. And genocide is happening today under our noses, unstopped and allowed to progress its course without being stopped. We have as yet no means to challenge the perpetrators during a genocide and bring them to justice. And that is why I see we are still in the darkness of genocide. What happened to me and my family and lots of other families across Europe is happening today in other parts of the world, particularly to the Uyghur in China, to the Rohingya in Myanmar, and the Yazidi in the region around the Syrian war. It is something that we must take seriously. It's excellent that we now have Holocaust Memorial Day. It's essential to commemorate and remember, but it's not enough without committing to action, without everybody committing to doing something during the year until we come back to the next Holocaust Memorial Day. And I hope people attending will be thinking what they can actually do to bring light to the darkness of unstoppable genocide. Now, I will tell my story, and I hope that the technicians will be able to put a few pictures on the screen, which makes it just that little bit more interesting, particularly to children, when I talk about my glorious future in Berlin. Until the Nazis came and took power in 1933, my dad was an up-and-coming judge. My mother ran a cinema advertising business. My 3 years older brother and me had a glorious future in front of us. The Nazi power grab dissolved that all inside a year. And by 1939, things had got so bad that our parents took the opportunity of the Kindertransport to send my brother aged 7 and myself aged 4 to England on the Kindertransport. That is my father's mother, my granny, who I actually met a few times and I vaguely remember meeting. The next one should be one of my grandfathers, that's my mother's father, and the next one should be his wife, my other granny. I spent a lot of time with my granny. My grandfather, this grandfather was already dead. I never knew my other grandfather because he died long before I was born. But I spent a lot of time with this granny because they were a Christian family, and it was a little bit safer for me to be with my granny and my aunt in a Christian family because I apparently couldn't be silenced, and two children together make a hell of a noise, and that can be dangerous. The next one should be my parents' wedding. That's my mum and dad on their wedding day. And the next one should be, I think, my brother, yes. I adored my big brother, and that was enormously important. I think the next one shows how important. No, we'll skip that. That is me, age 2. A very normal, happy, scruffy 2-year-old, because I was mainly kept indoors and unaware of the horrors going on outside, though I must have seen some because I have sort of flashbacks. And I think I absorbed the tension. The last picture is of Martin pushing me in a pram, which is so important because we were brought up not only to be together a lot, but to be concerned about each other. And that was hugely important. The 10 years we didn't see our parents when we were in England, my brother looked after me. The first foster family was a disaster. A Christian rector, because our parents wanted us to be brought up Christian to protect us from anti-Semitism, which was pretty rife in this country, and it did protect us. But our foster mother, his wife, had no children of her own, and I think was clueless, and she was actually very cruel to us, particularly to me. She used to beat me with a leather strap until my brother contacted a doctor. I think a doctor came to immunize us, and he told them, because I had to sleep on my stomach because my back was raw welts. The Quakers, I think, were notified. They sponsored us, and when they realized how unhappy we were, they sent us to a Quaker boarding school, which was wonderful. We were treated exactly like everyone else there, so we fitted in. Nobody knew that we were refugees. By that time, we spoke perfect English. And that was a lovely 2 years until our foster father, the vicar, died. And of course, they had to vacate. We couldn't go back there. We were put in a hostel for several months whilst they found another family for us. This time it was a family with 5 children, and they treated us exactly the same as their own children, quite strictly because it was wartime, etc. But children mingle, and we were very happy there indeed for about a year until the doodlebugs came over. That is what we nicknamed the flying bombs, catapulted from the Belgian coast by the Germans with just enough fuel to reach London and drop as gigantic bombs. And we were living in the path of these doodlebugs. They put guns all round to try and shoot them down and stop them getting to London, which I actually found exciting with the other children. But Martin just couldn't bear it because he knew which direction they were coming from and that it was Germany, and he actually experienced the doodlebugs as if his mother was throwing bombs at him, and he went berserk. He had to be moved. And that is why we came to yet another, the 3rd foster family, another family with 4 children, which made it very welcoming, a lovely family, and it was a farm. I really was in 7th heaven with the animals on the farm. And very soon after we reached the farm, the war ended. We all had celebration parties, and then all the restrictions continued year after year after year. 4 years went by after the end of the war. From the end of the war, we had already lost any contact with our mother in Germany. I thought she must be dead, otherwise she'd pick me up and take me home, as she always did when I stayed with my granny. And we had telegrams and then letters from our father, who escaped at the last moment to Shanghai, and they stopped when the war stopped. In retrospect, I think there was such chaos that delivery of letters, etc., broke down. But I thought that our dad too must be dead and that we were orphans. And I really put down roots in this family. I got on so well with. And by the time I was 14 in 1949, 10 years after coming over, I had decided that I was going to be a farmer. I was going to leave school at the end of that school year. You could leave at 14 at that time. I was going to be a farmer. That was going to be my life. And I thought that's as good as it could possibly get. And then my mother suddenly appeared. And she came over to take me back to Germany. My father had come back from Shanghai, and they had given my brother a choice. And he chose to stay in England because he was doing a scholarship to Cambridge, which he got and went there. They didn't give me the choice. And you can imagine how bitter I felt about that I was forced. I refused to go, but my father served a court order on my foster mother, who had to take me to Germany and leave me there, which was a repeat of the kinder transport the other way round. And it felt like the final betrayal. The one person I felt I really could trust, my 3rd foster mother, was prepared to take me to Germany of all places and dump me there. A 14-year-old can't work things out very well, particularly when she is very disoriented. I turned nasty, as teenagers will do when they feel in an impossible situation. I gave my parents hell, but they were decent people and realized it was a mistake. And they let me come back to England on the promise that I would stay at school and go out to visit them every school holiday, which of course I did. But it took a year to get back to England, the worst year in my life. I was terrified of Germany, and Germany really was a terrifying place in 1949. Gradually, as I kept going out on visits and got older and more sensible, I came to terms with Germany, and I now have relatives, and my brother went back to Germany in the end. He met a nice German au pair girl when he was in Cambridge. He wasn't forced to go back, he chose to go back, so I have relatives there. I've come to terms with Germany and enjoy going there. Particularly back to Berlin, and my daughter loves to come with me. My parents settled in Mainz. They didn't settle back in Berlin. But I stayed in England. I could not face Germany. That year had completely destroyed it for me. And to my shame, I rejected my German roots right until I was 54, and Bertha Leverton, one of the Kindertransport, organised a 50th reunion of our coming to England. At that reunion, I met hundreds of Kinder I didn't know existed. I thought up until then only my brother and I came from Berlin to England. I was that naive and sheltered in the countryside. It was a shock to me, and I realized that with a stable marriage and 3 teenage children, I was secure and confident enough to face the past. And I did a lot of quick catching up. I realized I had been avoiding anything to do with the war, the Holocaust, the past. I did quick catching up in time for when the government in 1991 put Holocaust education in the national curriculum. I was ready to join a group of people willing to go into schools and talk with the teachers and the children. And I've been doing it ever since. I had been a secondary school teacher for 19 years, and I had retrained as a psychotherapist, and I had a private practice. My time was my own to schedule. I was able to decrease my practice and increase my time to talk in schools. And eventually I retired, and this is what I still do. That is my work, speaking, giving my testimony, and supporting activists of today. I support a young group of really vibrant activists called Yet Again UK. It's worth looking up their website. They are really doing great things, and I have the pleasure and privilege of encouraging them and suggesting things. We work together. And I also take any opportunity I can to further the cause of opening up genocide and getting the means to bring perpetrators to justice. This group fought hard to get the amendment to the trade bill passed. It nearly did pass. It's been rejected before. It almost got through, and this group is not going to stop. They are going to get it through. They are also tackling the international laws on legally interpreting genocide when perpetrators are sent to the international court. At the moment, the focus is on intent of the perpetrator, which is absolutely absurd because intent is almost impossible to prove. Whereas shifting the focus onto the damage done to victims is easily visible and measurable. We have to get that shift, like we have to get that shift in who is responsible for calling out genocide. It should be a legal definition, not a political one. I think I have overrun my time.
Thank you so much, Ruth, for sharing your testimony and also your passions with us. We've had some lovely comments I've seen coming in to the chat, thanking you for sharing your testimony and also for the different works that you were doing. And I'm sure there will be interesting questions for you in the Q&A.
I've actually got 2 books if they want more.
We'll have to discuss them in the Q&A. I'm sure people would be really interested in hearing about them. So thank you so much. And we'll come back to you in a moment for the Q&A. But for now, I would like to invite our second speaker to share her testimony with us. So I would like to introduce our second speaker, who is Joan Salter. Joan has also been very committed to our museum for many years, sharing her testimony with school children. She's also given her time as part of our Holocaust Legacy project, sharing her memories, her photographs with us for our Memory Books projects. Thank you so much for joining us to speak today, Joan, and I will now hand over to you for your testimony.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Emma. Oh, it says, it's telling me the host has stopped my video. No. And I seem to be on mute.
We can still see you, Joan.
Right, okay.
That is brilliant. Thank you. We can see you and hear you.
Me?
Absolutely.
Okay. Right. Now, unfortunately, because of the problems with the split screen, I don't have the presentation. But basically, my parents were Polish Jews who were in their 20s, in the 1920s, after Poland was reunited as a country. And they had moved to Western Europe. My father, like many Jews from the part of Poland he came from, which was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, had a certain level of assimilation. And when Poland was reunited, many of them actually left Poland purely and simply for a better life. Not because of the pogroms, which the earlier emigrations from the Russian part had been. Anyway, my mother actually was married to a French Jew and had had a child. And very sadly, she was widowed. And my parents met in Paris in 1938 and actually went to Poland, to my father's hometown, for their wedding. And they were going to Austria on their honeymoon, but they were very lucky that that didn't happen. It was because it was Purim, and his family were traditional, not ultra-Orthodox, but traditional. And my parents stayed with them for the extra few weeks over Purim. And that was lucky, because if they'd been in Austria when the Anschluss had happened, neither they nor I would be here. Anyway, they returned to Paris, but once Poland was occupied and they realized what was going on, Belgium was officially neutral. And my father thought the Germans wouldn't bother with Belgium, but he knew they would come to France. So at the end of 1939, my parents with my half-sister moved to Brussels. And in February 1940, I was born. And my name at that time was Fanny Zimmerbaum. And I was 3 months old when Belgium was taken over by the Nazis. And from the very beginning, they targeted the foreign Jews. There were a very high percentage of Polish Jews in Western Europe at that time, because in effect, both Britain and America had virtually closed the doors to them. But because of the losses in World War I, the France and Belgium, they needed more people, so we were there. Anyway, my father was taken and he was imprisoned for several months, and then he was deported. And he was deported on an ordinary train, and he jumped from the train and he made his way back to Paris, and he went into hiding with a cousin who had French nationality, because in France, a lot of the Jews had been given naturalization, and as such, there was an agreement between the Vichy government and the Germans that the native Jews would not be deported. Anyway, my mother got permission from the Belgian police for us to travel to Paris, and we went and stayed with one of my aunts. My mother was one of 8 children, the second youngest. Of course, by the time I'm speaking about the late 30s, early 40s, all her family were already in the late 30s, 40s, even 50s. And so we stayed with my aunt for a while, but my half-sister, who had not been terribly thrilled when her mother had remarried, and was even less thrilled when she was presented with the younger sister. And I think Ruth had made a similar comment that the family couldn't trust her to keep her mouth shut either. And they were so worried that my sister would inform the teachers that mother was visiting father. And therefore, my mother fell out with her sisters because they had French nationality. They were all married to French Jews. Anyway, we then went and stayed in a boarding house, which was run by people who were involved in what became known as the resistance, although we tend to think of that as a unified organization, but a lot of it was just local people helping people to hide and things like that. Anyway, long story short, my father was nearly rounded up again, and again he managed to escape and was taken down into Vichy, which was the southern part of France, which was officially unoccupied. However, the Vichy government were not only collaborators, they were proactive. Even before the Germans asked for women and children, the Vichy government were already starting to round up women and children. Anyway, so my father was down in Vichy. He was able to get new papers in a little village near Lyon, and he was working on a farm. Anyway, I come now to July 1942. My mother had to go every week to the local police station to register. We were aliens. Anyway, it was a very hot weekend, and my mother went in with my sister and myself, and each week there was the same 2 policemen. One was a very gentle, kindly man, and the other one was very, very seriously anti-Semitic. Anyway, my mother was holding me. She went to the short queue, which was the nasty man, because all the Jews were terrified of him. So most of them had lined up in front of the kind policeman. And I'm referring now to this year's theme of Holocaust Memorial Day, the light in the darkness. What happened was my sister started crying to be picked up, and the nasty policeman threw us out, and we crept back in, and we went to the kindly policeman, who pretended he couldn't find our name on his list, and who found a reason to send the other policeman out to look for another list in the main office. And he then turned round to my mother and said, "There is going to be a roundup of women and children this weekend." And this is notorious this weekend. And at the time I was 3.5. What happened was the women and children were rounded up, and the government had an agreement with the Nazis that children under 16 would not be deported. And the Nazis actually did not want the children deported because they knew that that would break the myth that they were only deporting people for labor. Anyway, we were smuggled out and taken down into Vichy. And for a little while, we were together with my father. Now, that roundup has become infamous, the Vel d'Eve. When the mothers and children were separated, it was a terribly hot weekend. No food, no water, no toilet facilities in a velodrome. And then the mothers were sent to a camp, either Pithers or Bure, and the children were sent to Drancy. Anyway, had I at 3.5 been there, I would not have survived. And even if I had survived those few months that the children were held in Drancy, I would have been one that was sent, this time on a sealed train, to the east. And this has finally been documented because of Klaus Klausfeld, a Jewish historian, because up until 96, France held this myth that they were not collaborators, that they were the victims. Anyway, so to get back to our story, my father once again was rounded up in a camp in Vichy. The camps in Vichy were a lot more porous because they were guarded by the French. And actually the French resented having to pay and feed these people. So they were allowed out on farms and things like that. Anyway, my father escaped and he managed to get over the mountains into Spain. And from there he got to Lisbon. And as a Polish Jew, as a Pole, he was able to join part of the British forces and come to England. And he thought we had died because he was waiting for us in Spain and we didn't turn up. Anyway, eventually we were carried over the mountains and we were I was put into prison with my mother and my sister was put into a convent. And the Americans had been asked to organize a rescue for the children in Drancy. And it had taken them nearly 2 years to actually agree to do it. Long story short, my mother gave us up. We went to America. My sister was very ill on the boat and they knew that her father had died of tuberculosis and she was put in hospital. I was taken in by a foster family. By that time, I was 4.5. And the same thing happened to me virtually as with Ruth, in that our past was completely cut out. My name was changed. I became Joan Farrell. And I lost my French. You know, I was told to be a nice little American girl. And I was 7.5 when one day I came home to be told that my parents had survived the war. Holocaust was not a word used. And I was sent to England to meet these people who were completely devastated. It took a long time. I spent the next 10 years going backwards, forwards between my two families. Anyway, I became a youth and community worker and became a local authority officer in charge of the grant-aided education service in Tower Hamlets. And when Ilya was folded up, I actually went and did my first degree. I then started researching because, as Ruth said, there was very little spoken about the Holocaust, and I was not part of any group. And just like Ruth, I thought, you know, it was my sister and I were the only ones in the world this had happened to. And I started doing research and writing papers and have done a postgraduate research degree, and I've been involved in education, Holocaust education now, for a long time. I'm not going to say how many years. You can work out how old I am. Anyway, and as I said, some of the things, although my story is different to Ruth, I think that isolation and the fact that we were not in control of our lives. You know, if somebody said you go here, you go there, your name is this, your name is that. And that took a very, very long time to overcome. Anyway, that's basically my story. I don't know whether I've gone over time or not, but I think it opens up for questions, Emma.
Thank you so, so much, Joan, for sharing your testimony. And you weren't over at all. That was perfect. And you were absolutely right. I think looking at the comments that we're having coming in, thanking you for sharing your testimony, I can tell there are going to be many questions for both you and Ruth, who I am going to now invite back to come and join us for the questions. There will be time for questions from everybody watching. So if you do have a question that you would like to ask one or both of our speakers, do type it in the question and answer box, which will be at the bottom of your screen. If your question is for a specific speaker, please put their name in the question so I know who to address it to. If it's for both your speakers, then do indicate that as well. Whilst we give people time to type their questions into the box, I would like to start by asking a couple of questions of my own. I would like to start with you, Ruth. So you shared your testimony beautifully with us, and I know many people found it very powerful. You also shared with us some of the things that you've gone on to do since arriving in Britain. You talked about getting into speaking, you touched upon being a secondary school teacher, and you just gave us a little glimpse just before we left you of some of the books you've written. I wonder if you could expand a little bit more about what you've gone on to do, perhaps explaining some of the writing projects that you've done.
Yes, my first book actually was a school textbook. I was asked to take the 16-year-old girls that nobody wanted in their classes and give them lessons in baby care, which I bought because you don't just teach baby care. I created a course that taught the whole life cycle, and I wrote a book for it. And I didn't think of myself as a writer then until I started talking in schools, and I could never have enough time to talk and answer all their questions. So I wrote my autobiography specifically for school libraries, and that was welcomed. I wrote a couple of other books for the National Holocaust Center. They published them. I donated them to them because I wanted to express my thoughts. This one is Love, Hate and Indifference, the slippery slope to genocide. And this one is Quality and Inequality, the value of life, which is very topical at the moment, with Lord Sumption challenging to her face a woman who had multiple cancer and telling her her life was not as valuable as other people's. I think that was dreadful. And finally, I wrote my family story. My autobiography was mainly about me. This is about our family, which I discovered when a German author wrote a novel about my father, who she researched in Shanghai. And of course it was fiction, and I didn't know what was fact and what was fiction, and that set me off on finding out. They made a film of the German novel, and whenever I was in Germany, people asked me what was fiction and what was true, and I often couldn't answer. So I researched it, and my son Barry, who's interested in amateur drama, suggested a play. So I made a deal with him. I'll write it, you produce it, and he did in Liverpool with his drama group 2 years ago. Anybody who wants either of these, any of these books, just email me. Do you want to put my email up on the screen?
We can share it in the chat if you would like at the end of the talk,
Yes.
or if anyone would like to get in touch with the museum, we can pass any inquiries on to Ruth as well.
Shall I write it in the chat?
Yes, if you would like to. And if anyone misses it for any reason, do feel free to get in touch with the email address that sent you the link to join. For now, I will move over to Joan. Joan, thank you so much for your testimony. You also touched on different things that you've gone on to do since the end of the war. And one thing you mentioned was your study and your research, as well as going into speaking about your experiences. I wonder if you could expand a little more on that.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think similar to Ruth, when I started looking into my past, although my parents told me things that had happened, well, my father more than my mother really had what you'd call post-traumatic stress disorder and really didn't speak very much. But my father was telling all these fantasy stories, so I thought, about jumping off trains and God knows what. And when I started looking into it and asking people, I was told no children got out during the war. Well, I knew it had happened because I had a family in America and whatnot. And I was very lucky that I had done the degree at London School of Economics, and I was put in touch with David Wyman, who wrote a book called The Abandonment of the Jews. This was about 1980, when the Holocaust was just beginning to come out of the closet, basically. And I went to America to a conference, and I met him there. And he helped to get me into the archives of the Joint Distribution Committee and the Quakers. And that was the beginning of my research and whatnot. Anyway, I did, and I started researching what had happened in Britain, you know, because the children were refused, the Vichy government had offered to let the children out. Anyway, I did write an academic paper comparing the response to the Kindertransport and the children in France who were of Polish Jewish origin, because even here, even within the Jewish establishment, there was a lot of prejudices against the Polish Jews. Anyway, at the same time, after my father died, I actually went to Poland and I got involved with Tarnów, which is where my father came from. And contrary to what a lot of people assume about Poland, the town has a local historian and head of the museum has done an awful lot to remembrance of both the Jews and the Sinti communities from there. And in recent years, I've actually given a PowerPoint and a lecture at an international conference about Tarnów and what had happened there. And I used testimonies of people who were there, and so on and so forth. And just like Ruth, I think a lot of us, we speak, but why do we speak? You know, I don't need official recognition to know what happened to my family. And to some extent, that is my personal pain. I don't need other people to validate it. But like Ruth, I feel very strongly about prejudice and how it spreads. And we know, you know, anyway, actually, today I was giving testimony to Parliament about the all-party committee for genocide to prohibit genocide. And so, yes, so I think that is something that's become very important, not just that I'm telling people about my past, but we're trying to get people to understand just how dangerous stereotyping of people and not standing up to injustice. And so that's kept me busy. Thank you, Emma.
Yes, thank you so much, because of course the theme for Holocaust Memorial Day this year is to be the light in the darkness, and it encourages us to reflect that that darkness is not just the darkness of the Holocaust and in the past, but looking at where there is darkness today and what we can do to bring light. And so, Ruth, I'd like to turn to you and ask, where do you see darkness today, and how do you think we as individuals and organisations can do our bit to bring light? Oh, we would just unmute you, Ruth. There we go.
I see the presence of genocide today as an unconscionable darkness. How can we possibly live with people going through this in other parts of the world? Okay, they're far away from this country, but we're all one human species. And I challenge, wherever I see it, discrimination between superior peoples and inferior peoples. There's no such thing. We're all temporary tenants on this earth, and we should accept this. And as any tenant, we should at least leave our tenancy in as good health as we came into it, if not better. I don't think people on the whole think enough outside their comfort zone and their box. My one aim is to challenge people to think. I'm not in the business of telling people what to think. I just want people to think a lot more. And I firmly believe that if enough people got together in small groups, even on virtual meetings like Zoom meetings right now, and discussed major issues of concern together, respectfully, listening to each other, welcoming different points of view, learning from each other, I firmly believe that potential solutions to all our problems would arise. They're not going to arise through divisiveness and fighting each other. I thought Joe Biden brought that beautifully across in his inauguration acceptance speech. I hope you all heard it.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Yes, that's a very powerful message. Joan, would I be able to ask you the same question? Where do you see darkness today, and what do you feel we can do to bring about light?
Well, polarization is so easy to do. And, you know, Hitler did it. He knew exactly how to create divisions, how to create hate. And in the 60s and 70s, most of the research that was done regarding the Holocaust was how had it happened. And there were loads of so-called I'm thinking, there was what was known as the Stanford prison, which was like a week-long working where they divided, and these were liberal students from California. Half were prisoners and half were the prison officers. And after 2 or 3 days, they had to stop it because it got so vicious. And there's been loads of other things done in universities, academics, to show how easy people will respond to an authority figure. and how they will lose all sense of morality and turn against other human beings. So it really is very, very dangerous. We're at such a polarized time politically, you know. It seems if you follow one party or the other, sort of you blindly accept whatever they do and you hate anything that someone from a different party does. And what happened in Washington, the storming of the Capitol, somebody said, what did I think about it? Well, I was horrified, but I was not surprised. I was brought up in America, and I know the scars of the South, you know, are still there. The division and the prejudice against people who are different, and you know, it is very, very frightening. And yes, I do agree. Biden appears to be a man who will try to heal it, but he's got an Everest to climb. It's not going to be easy. Platitudes will not get people together. 74 million voted for Trump because he promised them he was going to make America great again. He didn't really explain what he meant by that, but I think most of them thought, well, we won't have to pay tax and, you know, and I'm all right, Jack. And, you know, this is the darkness. I think, like Ruth says, people are willing to accept. They don't think, and they just follow the leadership and the stereotypes, and it's very easy to build up hate. So yes, there's a lot of darkness, even in what we look upon as civilized societies. Yeah.
So many places where there is still a need to bring light. And I can see from the comments that are coming in that your words are really resonating with people. And we've got,
Can
oh
I
yes,
just
do go,
add
Ruth.
to that? Because I think the idea of hate is so important. And it's to do with power and control. It's quite easy to whip up hate, particularly if you convincingly tell people lies. They are gullible and they will respond quite quickly with developing hate. Hate that really comes from frustrations in their lives from all over the place, can be psychologically quite easily focused together and directed on a target. Because to hold hate in yourself needs an outlet. So once you've aroused hate in a rabble and given them a target to vent that hate on, you have started the slippery slope to genocide. And I agree with Joan, that is so frightening.
Yes, yes, it very much is. I have one final quick question from me before I hand it over to some brilliant questions I can see coming in. I'd like to start with you this time, Joan. For our temporary online exhibition to coincide with this event, which I will speak more about in a moment, you shared a quote which I found very powerful. You said to me, "Holocaust is a part of me, but it does not define me." You've mentioned very many different things that you've gone on to do, and I'd like to ask, how do you define yourself?
Okay, well, yes, I know, speaking as a survivor and an educational person has become very important. However, it is only part of me. I have another life, and I don't like any sort of hierarchy and sort of insinuating that one person's journey is more important than another. And I think for most of us, especially those of us who are children and who were taken away from our culture and our family, and also probably just didn't have the tools for family and motherhood, I think one of the most important parts of my life is that I am a mother. I have 2 adult children and one grandson, and a husband has stayed with me for over 60 years. So that is one part of me. I've got an academic part. I'm also at the moment working on a film about what had happened in France with an American company. So yeah, there's lots of things that keep me going, but I don't wake up in the morning and say, oh, I'm a Holocaust survivor. Aren't I something special? Because most of us who did survive, it was luck. It was perhaps one kind person like the policeman, and then those who carried me over the mountains in the winter into Spain. And the Quakers played a very big part in my survival, and they haven't had the recognition they should have had because they were working a lot in Europe. And so, yeah, I define myself, I think part of being split between two families, I do compartmentalize myself, and I changed my coat and become a different person. So I'm loads of things to different people.
Thank you so much. And Ruth, could I ask you the same question? How do you define yourself, and what role does the Holocaust play within that?
Well, as a child, we, the Kinder of the Kinder transport, were led to believe we were the lucky ones to whom nothing happened.
Yeah.
Until Bertha Leverton brought us together and we realized that an awful lot had happened. Up until that time, my identity was so messed up, I really didn't know who or what I was. I was determined to live. I was very well aware of that. I was well aware that there were forces that wanted to kill me, get rid of me, and I was going to cling on. But I didn't know why, I didn't know who I was. Until I was 54, I did not manage to unscramble that and own myself, the bits I'd rather not have, as well as the bits I do like having. And I've managed to achieve peace of mind, which I did not have at all before the age of 54. I was fighting myself a lot of the time because I didn't know who I was. I've achieved peace of mind, and that is what I would wish everybody in their life to achieve. And I will do anything that I have the opportunity to do to help people attain peace of life. And I think I can do a lot through the opportunities I have in Holocaust education, but that's not the only source. But it's these things that keep me alive.
Thank you so much, both of you. Now it is time for me to turn to the questions that we've had come in from our audience today. We've got a brilliant selection of questions on different topics. One theme that I can see is coming up a few times is the relationship between your experiences and Judaism. So one question in particular, do you feel like your experiences cemented your faith even more in Judaism? Could I turn to you, Joan, for that question?
Well, people say, did the Holocaust change? But of course, I was too young, to have a faith before or not have a faith. I have to say, after the upheaval of being removed from one family in America to a family here who were completely broken and whose attitude was God had forsaken them, so they didn't want to have anything to do with God. But they sent me to an ultra-Orthodox Jewish school because they were so frightened of the outsider. And that did not suit my personality, this sort of having to conform to somebody else's rules. And I did go to Israel as a young woman. I trained there. I had a scholarship to course there. And it was ironically in Israel that I lost my faith, because it was a religious holiday, and I went to a very religious kibbutz down in the Negev. And we went in the daytime, and in the daytime, they were all dressed like normal farmers. It was hot and shorts and whatnot. And all of a sudden, I think it was Shavuot, and they had a yeshiva on the kibbutz. And as the women, we were allowed to go upstairs and look down. And I looked down, and these people who in the daytime had been kibbutznik, no different to any other, suddenly took on the things of the ultra-Orthodox. And I looked at it, and to me, I was watching theater, and I could not believe in it. I have joined later on, I joined the liberal movement, which suits me much better because it is very inclusive and allows us to think for ourselves. And I think, like most of us who survived and finally found out who we are, the last thing we're willing to do is to be told how we should think or what we should do. So, yeah, did the Holocaust affect my faith? For a long time, I didn't want to be Jewish. I didn't want to have anything to do with it. I married a Jew who was even less religious than I was. And it took me a long time. I think part of the journey to come to terms with who I was coming to terms with what my family had been through. And then I wanted to identify as a Jew. I wanted to say, in effect, to my grandparents, my aunts and uncles and cousins, I am one of you. And that was when I joined a liberal synagogue.
Thank you so much. I'm looking through the comments that we have. I'd like to bring one to you, Ruth, if I can. We've got many thanks for sharing what was a traumatic early life, and asking if you could say a little bit about how you've managed to come to terms with your experiences, and has forgiveness played a part in this?
My husband was a psychoanalyst, and he persuaded me to have psychotherapy. I never thought of it myself, but I did a lot of extra to support him through his training as a psychoanalyst, and he said, it's your turn. And I didn't realize how much I needed psychotherapy, and I was able to use it up to a point where I could carry on the huge task of finding my real self myself. That's quite emotional still, and I've lost the plot of the question. I always do when I get into the emotional area. What was the question again?
How you've managed to come to terms with your experiences, and whether forgiveness has played a role in this.
Forgiveness, yes. I have great difficulty with forgiveness. I was brought up Christian, incidentally, because I think I've already said, my parents wanted me protected from anti-Semitism, which it did do. But that first foster family, I lived hypocrisy without knowing the word. And therefore, I never thought much of Christianity, which is a shame, because that was just one example. But the Christian take on forgiving without reservation, I just can't understand it. If somebody hurts me in any way and regrets it and says sorry, I have absolutely no difficulty in forgiveness. But how can I forgive anybody who doesn't even regret what they've done? And I don't think it's my business to forgive anyone who hasn't yet reached a stage of understanding and accepting and regretting what they've done. Now, I'm only too willing with my psychological training to help anybody who reaches that stage. But how can I forgive somebody who isn't asking for forgiveness, isn't on the road to forgiveness? So I have a lot of trouble with that. I've had a lot of trouble forgiving myself for the way I treated my parents. I didn't want them to come alive, and that is awful. That really is awful. That took a lot of accepting in myself and forgiving myself for going through that phase. Unfortunately, I didn't really establish the relationship with my parents that I would like to have before they died naturally. Particularly my mother. I hurt her deeply, deeply. But my daughter has rescued me. I have a wonderful relationship with my daughter who knows and plays into giving me something of a respite from that relationship I could never have.
Thank you so much for being so open and sharing that with us. Joan, if I could turn to you, we've had a question come in wanting to know more about how you were treated by your American family and the people you came into contact with in America.
Okay, yeah, now that's quite a good question, because the first 3-4 years of my life when I lived with the family, I was very happy. I was very well treated. However, and I only have vague recollection of this because, as I said, my past was cut off. My sister turned up in my life, and she was much older than me, and she was very, very badly treated. Anyway, I was very close to my American father. My foster mother, in the beginning, was very doting, but rather smothering. Anyway, long story short, I have seen the social worker's report and the whole attitude, and it was very similar with what happened to a lot of the kinder, because the agency which brought us up would have been financially responsible for us. They were very happy. Any home that came along, that was good enough. And my relationship with my foster mother did break down. As an adult, I began to realize exactly this was someone with a very toxic personality disorder. And when she died, and with my foster sister, we cleared out papers. It was a very large house, and the whole of the top floor was full of her letters and her writings, which showed a very troubled mind. And I was not at all surprised to see before she had that she'd been turned down by virtually every adoption society in America, who realized that she was not suitable to have a child. So, you know, that took a long time, because we were all told, even in the 1980s, when I went to this conference in America and I gave testimony, and I did explain that, you know, things were not good there. The interviewer said to me, "America saved you. You must be grateful." And that was it. That was, you know, pat on the head. You're very lucky. You've survived. You've got to be grateful. Well, I think that was as much my coming to terms with. I nearly used a very rude word, but they can all go to blazes. No one is telling me I have to be grateful, you know? So, yeah, so it was very complicated, yeah. And as Ruth says, also the relationship with our parents, you know, I'm quoting another child survivor who came from Theresienstadt, Jackie Young, and how he says it: we were all like a train that left a station, and somewhere along the line, the train divided into two things, and each side of the train ended up in a different place. And that was it. The world had moved on. I had nothing in common with my parents. I was lucky. They lived quite an older age. And my father and I did develop quite a close relationship in the final years of their lives, but I never was close to my mother. And someone, sort of said, oh, well, that's because she resented she gave you up. I don't think it was that. It was that we had nothing in common. I was a completely different person. When I first came to England, we didn't even have a common language because my French had been completely wiped out. No doubt, when we went to America, we were told not to be foreign, to be little American children. So, it's complicated, very complicated. And please don't think I'm not grateful to America, but, right. No more.
It's a very complicated and difficult situation.
Yeah,
And thank you for the person who asked that question. Really interesting, as all your questions are. Ruth, I would like to ask a question to you that we've had come in. You talked about how you got into sharing your testimony. Been asked, what was it like when you shared your testimony for the first time?
I was terribly nervous because it's so emotional. I think most of the people I know who do this sort of work, speaking in schools and other groups, started off very hesitantly. I feared that I would be speechless, that I would not be able to do it. But very quickly I grasped how interested the children and the teachers were. And I gradually gained confidence. And I started off because I thought that people need to learn about the Holocaust. And I very quickly realized that it was much more than that. People needed to be stimulated into thinking, into applying the results of the past to the present. And I used to, very early on, link my story with what was happening at the time, locally, nationally, and wider. Even though we were briefed, we were given a bit of training in public speaking as a group before we started. I don't know whether Joan had that, but the group that I joined did, and we were briefed that we must just tell our story and nothing else. I couldn't see the point of that. What's the point of telling our story if you don't relate it to wider thinking? And I never stuck to that. But I organized my talks from the beginning that I would have a coffee and a little while with the teacher in charge, so that I would get the background of the group I was talking to a little bit, and I could sound them out as to what the children already knew and what might be too much for them. And I always aimed at not going further than the teachers were happy with, because they would have to pick up the pieces. I wouldn't be there afterwards. And the teachers responded so well. They very quickly, I found the teachers wanted me to relate it to everything that I could relate it to. And that made it more enjoyable, because I felt that my story was of some use in getting people engaged and interested in actually doing something towards a better world. But I'm still disappointed that we don't seem to be any further on in stopping genocide.
Yeah. As you say, you're both so motivated to speak because there still is such a need for the valuable talks that you do. And that actually brings me to a question that I think is a nice one to close this Q&A before we move on to our candle lighting. The word inspiring and the word powerful have come up many times in the chat and do in this question. And they've asked, as we're reflecting about being a light in the darkness, what can we do to share your message? And perhaps you could share, what would you like your message to be to people who are watching today? Joan, if we could start with you and then I'll come to Ruth.
Right. Oh dear.
It's a big question.
Well, yeah, I think one of the reasons I think it's so important for us to speak and to show our photos is to break down stereotypes for the students, for the people listening, to see us as human beings who were children, just like many of them. And I think very often children do relate to our stories because, you know, they understand what it's like. But I don't like platitudes. You know, I agree with Ruth. We've been speaking, and sometimes we can look back and say, what have we achieved? Because there's no question. I mean, when I first started speaking in the 80s, I was not aware of any anti-Semitism. And in more recent years, I've had a few loaded questions. And not that I object to that, because I'm quite happy to discuss things. But you do get the feeling that you do wonder sometimes, what are we achieving? However, from the point of view of schools, it is much better, because when I first started speaking, I very often got the feeling that the teacher felt this was a day off for them. And right, children, here's a Holocaust survivor, and please sit still and be good and don't be rude, you know. And now more and more teachers are going on courses about teaching the Holocaust. And from that point of view, I think Holocaust education has improved a great deal. And because the teachers in the end, after we've given our testimony, they have to start talking with the kids and discussing with them the issues of importance. So, yeah, I've just like Ruth, I've forgotten what the question was that I started answering. But yeah, there's no easy answer because, you know, I don't know how many people have spoken, how many times, how many people we have spoken to, and yet there's still always the denial, you know, is there. Unfortunately, what is on social media, some kids do, you know, access. And also there is the problem of reinforcing. You know, there'll always be some people that come maybe from families that are anti-Semitic or, you know, very prejudiced. And to some extent, they'll hear our experiences and they will not have any sympathy for what happened. And that to me is a big worry. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. And Ruth, to close our Q&A, can I ask, what can we do to be a light in the darkness and share your message?
Well, my challenge is always to people not to think there's nothing they can do, because that is denial. Everybody has power, but few people use it. We need many more people to stand up and speak truth to power. That's a big one. I don't expect that from audiences of children, but I usually challenge them with don't be a bystander. If there's something in your locality that you no is wrong and is unacceptable, you don't have to accept it. The very least you can do is to stand up and say, this I do not accept, and other people will join you. And you can start a movement, you can write to your MP, you can do all sorts of things once you get a group together. That's the challenge I usually leave people. But it depends on how I feel the audience has gone. I've developed a way of feeling where the audience is at the moment, and I try to play as much as I can to where I feel they're at and go in whatever direction I think they're ready for and wanting and what they want to discuss.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ruth and Joan, for your thoughtful and very open answers. And thank you to everybody watching who shared those brilliant questions with us. We will shortly close with our candle lighting, but just before we do, I mentioned earlier on a temporary exhibition. Ruth and Joan and several of our other Holocaust education speakers, many of whom I've seen from the chat are joining us today, have contributed to a temporary online exhibition to mark Holocaust Memorial Day. This online exhibition explores the importance of Holocaust education and what motivates our speakers to do what they do. So we will be sharing the link to this exhibition at the end, and I will also share it in the chat shortly. So do explore that exhibition. I will now hand back over to Fran.
Thank you so much to everybody this evening. As we come to the end of this event, I'm delighted to be able to introduce our last speaker of the evening, the Mayor of Camden, Maryam Islamdoust. She'll be a familiar face to some of you who joined us last year for our Holocaust Memorial Day at the museum, as she led our candle lighting then as well. We're so pleased that she's able to join again this year, and our thanks go to her and Camden Council for partnering with us for this event. After this candle lighting, led by Mayor Maryam, we will be together observing just a moment's silence to remember those who were murdered in the Holocaust and to reflect on some of the things we've heard from our speakers this evening. Maryam, I'm going to pass over to you to lead us in this candle lighting, a moment of silence.
Thank you, Fran, and thank you, Ruth and Joan, for those incredible testimonies. Hello, everyone. My name is Maryam Islamdoust. I'm the Mayor of Camden. It is an honour to be here amongst Holocaust survivors, families of survivors, Ruth Barnett and Joan Salter, who shared their powerful testimonies to remember the 6 million Jewish people and many others who were victims of the greatest evil the world has seen. Holocaust Memorial Day and the yearly anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz are, of course, a time where we particularly remember the Holocaust. But we cannot allow it to be the only time. To secure the world against repeating such horrors requires constant remembrance and vigilance. We must always be the light in the darkness. I will now light a candle in memory of the 6 million Jewish people murdered. Please join me once it is lit to observe a minute's silence.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us for that moment science. And thank you, Mayor Mariam, for leading us on that. I'd like to finish this evening by thanking everybody, all of our visitors here today to the event, for joining with us to remember those who were murdered in the Holocaust and to consider the importance of remembering the Holocaust 76 years on. We'd like to invite you, as we approach the 27th of January and Holocaust Memorial Day itself, to light a candle in your own home this year, to both remember those who were murdered and to also consider what you can do to bring light where there is darkness today and to take forward those messages that we heard from both Ruth and Joan. I would like to thank both of our speakers for sharing their testimony and their insightful discussions afterwards in response to your many questions. I know I speak for all of us at the Jewish Museum when I say just how grateful we are for the time you give to our museum. And like Emma mentioned, we know there are several other of our Holocaust education survivor speakers in the audience tonight. And I'd like to extend that thanks to all of you for giving your time to Holocaust education and to the museum itself. Your words speak to thousands of students every single year. Thank you also to the Mayor of Camden for leading our candle lighting and for Camden Council for their partnership this evening. It means a great deal to us that even though we're not at the museum itself, we are still part of the Camden community. Thank you also to Peter, or I should say thank you to Peter, our BSL interpreter this evening, and to Joanne from Stage Text, who's been providing the live subtitling this evening. And finally, a big thank you to all of you who joined us from around the world this evening, we say, to mark Holocaust Memorial Day. It's our first time running this event virtually. So as you leave, you'll be guided to a short Q&A at the end. Any information you have about how this event has been virtually would be so helpful to us as we think about what to do in future years. And you'll also be directed to our new online exhibition, Light from Darkness, through quotes from our Holocaust survivors, and that will just appear on your screen in a moment. So thank you for joining us this evening. We would love to see you at one of our future events, but for now, have a lovely rest of your evening.